Hey, good morning. Welcome back to the Word and Coffee. I'm Chad. Yesterday we were in Genesis chapter 3, the chapter that deals with the original sin, the fall of man, the great tragedy for all of human history. And today we're in chapter 4. We're going to see examples of what that original sin led to in the family of Adam and Eve directly. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll be, like I said, in chapter 4, verse 1. All right. And the man knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain, and said, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. And Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain and his offering he had no respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said to Cain, Why art thou wroth, and why hast thou countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shall it not be lifted up? And if thou doest not well, sin coucheth at the door, and unto thee it is desire, but thou may rule over it. And Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother, and he slew him. And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel your brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth to me from the ground. And now cursed art thou from the ground, which hath opened up her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. So we're going to stop right there, and we're going to kind of talk a little bit. There's a lot more throughout chapter 4, and in these little quick morning times together, we're not really looking at in-depth study. These are just thoughts that are something that I find noteworthy, and hope maybe that it's something that you might be able to kind of grab onto and use for God's glory and just for a daily walk. But what I think is interesting here is these two guys, Cain and Abel, grew up in a family that was obviously a godly family. I mean, sure, sin had entered into the world because of disobedience, and but I think by today's standards, what we consider a godly family is certainly not to say, hey, this mom and dad never sin; they never do anything wrong. It's people who know God and who have a desire to do God's will and who love Jesus. That's what we look at as being a godly family, and I think we see that with Adam and Eve. They taught their sons obviously about God. They knew there was a God. Adam and Eve had spent time with God in the garden and had walked in the cool of the day with Him, and so they knew there was a God. There was no doubt in their mind. There's no atheist in the world yet. So Cain and Abel, they knew that there was a God. Now I find it interesting that Abel is mentioned in Hebrews 11 in the Hebrews a hall of faith. As a matter of fact, it says in Hebrews chapter 11 that by faith Abel made an offering to God. And I found that interesting because you think Abel was in faith. And what is faith? What does Hebrews tell us about faith? It is the substance of things hoped for, and the evidence of things not seen. So if Abel had faith, what that's saying is, of course, he hadn't seen God. He hadn't been directly involved with God the way his father and mother had, because he had to have faith. Adam and Eve, they didn't necessarily have to have faith in God existing because they knew He existed. I mean, they had an intimate a relationship with him that was a physical relationship, which was different than Abel, because of course Abel came along after sin had entered the world. So anyway, so Adam's not mentioned in the hall of faith, but Abel is. So Abel was the first man of faith on earth. So that, I think, is kind of an interesting thing, that just that one generation removed created that situation where Abel had to live by faith, and not by sight, as his father had lived, in the knowledge of having that direct relationship with God. So they're being taught by their parents all about God. They're the realization that God is there, that God exists, and they offer to God. Now, one of the other things I find to be kind of interesting, and I don't really know exactly what the nuances of this mean, but it talks about, okay, so Cain was born first, but then there's a transposition here, and again, she bore his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. It takes, okay, so Abel was born second, but then when the description's made, instead of saying, Abel was born, and then talking about, well, Cain was a keeper of, or a tiller of the ground, but Abel was a keeper of the flocks. It mentions Abel first. It even though it says, talks about Cain being born first, it starts giving a description of Abel first. So it changes and puts Abel more in a position of honor at this point, in saying, hey, Abel, even though Cain was born first, Abel, kind of took that position of the first position, in the way that the Bible mentions him and describes him. So I think that that's interesting, that, like I said, they describe what he did for a living before they describe Cain. So it puts him kind of ahead of Cain there. So in the process of time, it came to pass that they brought fruit of the ground as an offering to the Lord. Cain did, and then Abel brought the firstlings of his flock and the fat thereof. So what happened here was Cain grabbed whatever he had lying around, more or less. He brought fruit. It doesn't say he brought first fruit. It doesn't say he brought the best fruit. It just says he brought of the fruit of the ground. And then it says, but Abel, it gives the description, it gives adjectives. The firstlings of his flock and the fat thereof. So he brought the best. So first off, that's a contrast in how they were looking at this thing. Cain brought something, just whatever, and Abel brought the best that he had and gave it to God. So, that's another observation, just in the attitude of the way that we look at what God's given us, and the realization that it's all His. Every subatomic particle in the whole universe exists for God's glory, and it exists at His pleasure. It belongs to Him. Everything is His. And we lose sight of that so many times, in thinking that, well, I'm going to give God 10% of what's mine. Well, it's all His. I mean, every bit of it's His. And that 10% is a beautiful picture, because it is a tenth, and it's a beautiful picture of the whole. So that's why we use that 10%. That's why God, had that tithe, which of course is a derivative of the word tenth. Nonetheless, that's why we do that, is to represent that, sure, we've got needs, we have things we have to have, and so we use what God's given us for those things, for our daily needs, but at the same time, we've got that tenth that we give back, and I think that we lose sight of that so many times, that we want it all, and how do we skimp, and how do we sometimes ignore, hey, we had a landfall in something, or just a little bit of something extra that happened. We sold something at a yard sale or whatever. I mean, are we giving all that back? Are we saying, hey, we recognize God's providing for us everything, and we know it's all His, and we want to make sure that we honor Him with what we're doing. And obviously, Cain didn't do that. So we go back and we look in chapter 3, and we didn't cover this part of chapter 3 yesterday. Like I said, we just hit a few little thoughts. But when Adam and Eve sinned, what did they do? They covered themselves with fig leaves. They took from what God had created, and they decided they were just going to make themselves, something to cover themselves, to try to hide themselves from God, from the fact that His eyes can't, look on sin. They were trying to cover up, and this is some figurative language here that's used as we talk about coverings and everything. They were ashamed because they knew they were naked, and they were trying to cover up that. But it was because of that sin. And what happened? God had to kill an animal to cover them with the skin of that animal, and in the realization that they would have that blood has to be shed to cover sin. Sin is so serious that sin brings forth death, and that was what had to happen. An animal had to be killed in order for them to be covered, and even that wasn't sufficient. That was only something to be something kind of like what we would say is a stopgap measure, until Jesus Himself came as the ultimate sacrifice, who was totally sufficient to cover all sin. So Adam and Eve knew this, and Adam and Eve would have taught Cain and Abel this story. They certainly would have wanted to know, hey, Mom, Dad, you lived in this great garden and everything. What happened? Why aren't we there anymore? And Adam and Eve would have had to have told the story of sin and what happened in sin. So they would have known how God required the death of this animal, the bloodshed, in order to sacrifice for the sin that they committed. So Cain and Abel come before God, and Abel comes before God with the blood of a sacrifice to cover his sin. And he came before God in faith, as we're told in Hebrews chapter 11, because he was dealing with his sin. He was coming to worship God in a way that he had dealt with sin, in a way that he had sacrificed for sin, and had acknowledged his sin. Cain brought fruit and vegetables to God. And while there is the grain offering and things that we see later on, in the Bible, that was not an offering for sin. Sin had to be dealt with the shedding of blood, with an animal sacrifice. And so Cain comes before God with the attitude of wanting to continue in his sin and not deal with his sin, but yet still worship. How many times do we do that? How many times do we go to church on Sunday morning and sing praises to God and maybe have an emotional experience, and boy, that choir, that worship leader gets to us, and we get cold chills, and we have all these things, but we still want to deal with none of our sin. We want to come and we want to worship God. We want to play church. And I'm talking to myself too here. This isn't preaching. This is me saying, wow, this is no different than Cain. This is me coming before a holy God and not wanting to deal with sin in my life, and not wanting to acknowledge sin, but to continue in sin so many times, instead of just repenting of that sin the way Abel did. Abel came with the right attitude. Cain, on the other hand, he didn't have any desire whatsoever to deal with his sin. And God even mentions it to him. God even says, that he you know, that he was not, in any way dealing with the sin that he should deal with. He says, if thou doest well, shall it not be lifted, talking about his countenance. And if thou doest not well, sin coucheth at the door, and unto thee is its desire. He knew that, it sin wanted Cain, and Cain wanted sin. And God was trying to help him to see. I mean, a direct word from God to Cain, in the way that he was dealing, with him. So there was still communication there. It wasn't that God came down and walked with Cain the way he did with Adam, but he did have a direct communication with Cain, much the way he did with other people throughout the Old Testament. And Cain didn't want to deal with it. Cain wanted, once again, his sin. We see later on, Cain gets banished, and he's told that he's going to go and he's going to be a wanderer in the land of Nod, that he's being sent east of Eden to wander. And instead of wandering, he stops and builds a city. That's not what God had banished him to do. God had told him, you're going to be a wanderer, you're going to be a nomad that just moves around. And Cain instead decides to defy God again. And Cain never deals with this sin. Cain you never see repentance. You never see him sorry for what he did to his brother, sorry for the murder he committed, sorry for any of the sin in his life. All he deals with is, when God banishes him, and God takes his livelihood away from him, as the tiller of ground. To be a tiller of ground, you got to be stationary. You have to be in one place because you plant and it's long cycles. And God takes that away from him and says that the ground will no longer yield its strength to him. Instead of him being sorry for anything else, he's only sorry for himself. He says, this burden is too great. You can't do this to me, God. Why? I can't handle it. And how many times do we do that? How many times are we only sorry for our sin because of the consequences that the sin brings, not because of true repentance? I've heard it said so many times, being a Christian isn't about not going to hell. Being a Christian's about loving Jesus, and it is. And it's not all about our not going to hell. That's certainly a great, massive, huge benefit of being a Christian. I won't ever argue that. However, loving Jesus is the ultimate part of salvation. It's the ultimate part of our salvation story, and how much we do love Jesus, how much we benefit from that, and what it means to us. Well, those are, like I said, just some quick thoughts. Once again, this is by no means exhaustive. This is by no means anything that's going to be super in depth. These are just little quick thoughts to kind of go through the day with. Hope you'll join us again tomorrow. Have a good day.